The day started quietly, the kind of morning that promises nothing extraordinary, just the soft warmth of sunlight slipping through the windows and the usual hum of the neighborhood waking up. I was alone in the house as usual. My husband's work often took him away for days, sometimes weeks, and I was left with the silence that grew heavier every time he left. Today was no different. The kitchen faucet had been dripping for weeks, a small nagging sound that became impossible to ignore. I tried to fix it myself, turning wrenches and twisting pipes, but it was clear the problem was beyond my skills. So, after much hesitation, I finally called Jake, the handyman my neighbor had recommended. Jake was 25, young and full of a quiet confidence that was both reassuring and a little intimidating. When he arrived, he carried a large toolbox and wore worn-out jeans with a plain shirt. His smile was easy and genuine, and there was an openness in his eyes that put me at ease. "Hi, I'm Jake," he said, offering a handshake. "Thank you for coming on such short notice," I replied, returning the handshake. He nodded and immediately set to work, kneeling by the cabinet under the sink. I watched as his hands moved expertly, fingers inspecting each pipe, testing connections with a practiced ease. "You've got a pretty stubborn leak here," he remarked, glancing up at me. "Looks like a worn-out valve. I can fix it, but it might take a little time." I nodded, feeling grateful that someone was finally going to fix the constant dripping. As he worked, I busied myself with small tasks around the kitchen, trying not to stare but unable to help it. There was something calming about watching him work. His focus, the quiet determination in each movement. I realized I hadn't had this kind of company in a long time. After a few minutes, he straightened up and glanced my way. "You live here by yourself?" I hesitated for a moment. "My husband is away a lot for work," I said softly, unsure why I felt the need to explain. Jake nodded but didn't press further. Instead, he smiled kindly and went back to fixing the faucet. The room filled with the soft sounds of tools and running water as he worked. Occasionally, he'd ask me a question about the house or make a light joke to break the silence. But mostly, there was a peaceful quiet between us. It was in that quiet that something shifted. I noticed the warmth in his gaze when he looked my way, the way his eyes seemed to linger a moment longer than necessary. I tried to ignore it, telling myself it was just politeness or a friendly gesture. After all, he was here to do a job. But as the minutes passed, the air between us felt charged with something unspoken. When he finally tightened the last bolt and stood up, I felt a strange reluctance for him to leave. "All done," he said with a small smile. "No more leaks." "Thank you," I replied, feeling a flutter of gratitude and something more I couldn't quite name. I hesitated before asking, "Would you like some water? Or maybe coffee?" Jake seemed surprised but accepted my offer. We sat at the kitchen table, a fresh quiet settling between us. The soft hum of the newly fixed faucet filled the room. We talked about small things, the weather, the neighborhood, his work. But beneath the casual words, a subtle tension grew. There was a gentleness in his manner, a patience that felt comforting and unfamiliar. I found myself relaxing in his presence in a way I hadn't felt in a long time. He spoke about his life with a quiet honesty, sharing stories of his small-town childhood and the dreams that had brought him here. I shared little about myself, but somehow it felt enough. At one point, he looked at me with a seriousness that caught me off guard. "You seem tired," he said softly. I smiled sadly. "It's been a long time since my husband's been home." He nodded again, as if understanding more than the words could say. When he finally packed up his tools, I felt a pang of disappointment. The house felt emptier without him. "Thank you again," I said, walking him to the door. Jake smiled warmly. "Anytime you need help, just call." After he left, I stood in the doorway for a moment, listening to the silence. The house was still and quiet, but inside me something had stirred, a mix of emotions I wasn't ready to name. Later that evening, as I prepared dinner, I found myself thinking about Jake's easy smile and the way he had looked at me. There was no danger, no threat, only a kindness that felt like a balm to a tired soul. I told myself it was nothing, just a moment of connection in a life that often felt lonely. But deep down, I wondered if it was the start of something new, a chapter one hadn't expected but couldn't ignore. That night, lying in bed alone, I felt the weight of the day settle over me. The quiet house, the lingering scent of his cologne, and the memory of his steady hands fixing the faucet all mingled in my thoughts. I didn't know what tomorrow would bring, but for the first time in a long while I felt a flicker of hope. A small spark that maybe, just maybe, things could change. Next morning the house felt different. The quiet wasn't quite the same as before Jake's visit. I found myself glancing toward the door as if expecting him to walk in again, toolbox in hand with that same calm smile. It was strange how one person could change the atmosphere of a whole place. I tried to focus on my usual routine, cleaning, organizing, making sure everything was in order. But my mind kept drifting back to yesterday, to Jake's presence, to the way he had seemed so steady and reliable. As the day wore on, I realized how lonely I had grown used to being. My husband's long trips had left a space not only in the house but in my heart. I hadn't shared this feeling with anyone before. Not really. In the afternoon there was a knock at the door. My heart jumped. Was it Jake again? I opened the door to find him standing there, a bit hesitant, holding a small package. "I forgot this yesterday," he said, handing me a replacement valve that he said might last longer. I smiled, genuinely grateful. "Thank you. You didn't have to come back." He shrugged lightly. "Just wanted to make sure everything's perfect." He stepped inside and for a moment we just looked at each other, both unsure what to say. "Would you like some tea?" I asked, surprising myself. He nodded and I went to prepare it. We sat again at the kitchen table, the afternoon light casting soft shadows across the room. Jake's eyes were kind as he spoke about his work, about the small projects he enjoyed around the city. I listened intently, fascinated by the simple honesty in his stories. I realized how much I craved this kind of connection. A person who saw me not just as a neighbor or a client, but as someone who needed a friendly presence. As the tea cooled between us, Jake's hands folded on the table. He looked at me with a seriousness that made my heart beat faster. "You seem lonely," he said softly. I laughed nervously. "Is it that obvious?" He smiled gently. "It doesn't take much to see." His words struck a chord deep inside me. I wanted to tell him everything. The long nights, the empty rooms, the silence that sometimes felt like it might swallow me whole. But the words caught in my throat. Instead I nodded and said, "It's been hard, yes." Jake reached across the table, resting his hand briefly on mine. The touch was light but it sent a shiver through me. "I'm here if you ever want to talk," he said quietly. I looked down at his hand, then back into his eyes. There was no pressure in his voice, no expectation, just an offer of kindness. The moment felt fragile and precious. Suddenly, a noise from outside broke the spell. A car door slammed, footsteps echoed down the driveway. I stood quickly, heart pounding. "It's my husband," I whispered, panic rising. Jake nodded and packed up his things without a word. "Thank you for coming," I said, my voice shaky. He gave a small smile. "Take care." Before I could say more, he was gone, leaving the house feeling emptier than before. I closed the door and leaned against it, breathing heavily. That night, the silence was thicker than ever. I lay awake, replaying the afternoon in my mind. Jake's kindness, his gentle touch, the way he had seemed to see through the loneliness I tried to hide. For the first time in months I cried, not from sadness but from relief, knowing someone cared. The days that followed were a blur. My husband was still away and the house felt colder without Jake's presence. But I found myself looking forward to the next time he would come. When Jake did return a few days later, I greeted him with a smile that surprised me. This time he stayed longer, fixing small things around the house that I hadn't even noticed needed attention. We talked more freely, sharing little stories and laughter that filled the empty rooms with warmth. I began to realize how much I had missed having someone to confide in, someone who listened without judgment. Jake's presence became a light in the long, lonely days. One afternoon, as he repaired a creaky door, he paused and looked at me thoughtfully. "You deserve to be happy," he said quietly. His words echoed in my mind long after he left that day. I knew things were changing, but I wasn't sure where this path would lead. What I did know was that Jake's kindness had opened a door in my heart that I thought was closed forever. And as I drifted off to sleep that night, I wondered if maybe, just maybe, this unexpected friendship was the beginning of something new. Following those first few days, Jake's visits became a regular part of my life. It was strange how quickly I started to anticipate his arrival. Every time the doorbell rang, a mix of relief and excitement would flood through me. For months, I had lived with a quiet loneliness that weighed heavily on my shoulders. Now, with Jake around, that heaviness seemed to lighten, even if only for a little while. One afternoon, Jake showed up earlier than usual. He had a confident but gentle air about him, carrying a small toolbox that rattled softly as he walked inside. "I thought I'd get started early today," he said with a warm smile. I nodded, trying to hide how happy I was to see him. "That's very kind of you." He set his tools down and glanced around the room. "This place is looking better every time I come here. You've done a great job keeping it tidy." I felt a small spark of pride. "Thank you. It hasn't been easy, but I'm managing." Jake's eyes softened. "You're stronger than you think." His words touched something deep inside me, and for the first time in a long time, I allowed myself to feel hopeful. As he worked, I watched him move with purpose and care. The way his hands skillfully fixed the cabinet hinges, the focused expression on his face. It was comforting to see someone so dedicated to making things right. We talked casually about everyday things, work, the weather, simple pleasures. But beneath the surface, an unspoken understanding was growing between us. At one point, Jake paused and wiped the sweat from his brow. He looked up and met my eyes. "You know," he said softly, "if you ever need help with anything or just someone to talk to, I'm here." I smiled, grateful for his kindness. "Thank you. That means a lot." There was a brief silence, and then I found myself asking, "Why do you do this? Helping people around the neighborhood like this?" Jake shrugged. "It's rewarding. Fixing things, helping others. It gives my days purpose. Besides, it's nice to meet good people." I nodded, realizing how rare genuine kindness was in my life recently. Days turned into weeks, and Jake's presence became a steady comfort. I started to open up more, sharing stories about my past, my struggles, and my dreams. He listened without judgment, offering support and understanding. One evening, as we sat together after he finished fixing a leaking faucet, I felt a surge of emotion I hadn't expected. "Jake," I said quietly, "you've made such a difference in my life. I don't know how to thank you." He smiled warmly. "No need to thank me. Sometimes all we need is someone to be there." The honesty in his words made my heart ache with gratitude. As time passed, I noticed subtle changes in myself. I was no longer weighed down by loneliness. Instead, there was a new lightness, a renewed sense of hope. Yet with that hope came a lingering fear. What if this connection was just temporary? What if everything went back to the way it was before? One day, while Jake was working on the porch, I found myself watching him closely. The way his muscles tensed as he lifted a heavy board, the determined set of his jaw. It was hard to believe someone so strong could also be so gentle. After he finished, we sat on the steps, sharing a quiet moment. "I'm glad you're here," I said softly. He looked at me with a seriousness that made my heart race. "Me too." Our eyes met, and for a brief second the world seemed to pause. Suddenly, a noise from inside the house startled us both. My husband had returned unexpectedly early. Panic surged through me. I stood quickly, smoothing my clothes, trying to compose myself. Jake packed up his tools without a word, his expression unreadable. I opened the door just as my husband walked in, unaware of the tension hanging in the air. That night, I lay awake, the silence around me feeling heavier than ever. The unexpected reunion with my husband reminded me of the complicated life I was living. I cared for Jake deeply, but my commitments and responsibilities were tangled in ways I couldn't easily unravel. As dawn approached, I resolved to face the challenges ahead with honesty and courage. The path wouldn't be easy, but for the first time I believed I could find my way. The days after that unexpected encounter with my husband were some of the hardest I had ever faced. The tension in the house was thick, almost suffocating. I could feel the weight of every unspoken word hanging between us, making the silence unbearable. It was as if everything I had been trying to keep under control was suddenly slipping through my fingers. Jake, the handyman who had become my unexpected source of comfort, was still coming by, but now there was a new layer of caution in the air. Neither of us spoke about that day. It was like an unspoken agreement to pretend it hadn't happened. But the tension between us was impossible to ignore. One afternoon, as Jake was fixing a loose step on the porch, I found myself watching him carefully. His hands worked steadily, but his usually relaxed expression was tight, almost distant. It was clear the unexpected arrival had affected him too. I wanted to reach out to say something that might ease the discomfort, but the words got stuck in my throat. Instead, I busied myself with cleaning, pretending to be absorbed in the task. But inside, my thoughts raced. Later that evening, after Jake had left, I sat alone in the living room, the house eerily quiet. I couldn't shake the feeling that everything was changing, and not for the better. I thought about the choices I had made, the boundaries that had been crossed, and the consequences that might follow. Despite all this, I found myself longing for Jake's presence more than ever. He had become a symbol of kindness and hope in a life that often felt bleak and lonely. But I also knew that holding on to that hope was dangerous. Days passed, and the distance between Jake and me grew, even though he still came by to do his work. We exchanged polite conversation but avoided anything personal. The warmth that had once filled our interactions was replaced by a cautious coolness. One afternoon I found myself standing outside watching Jake work on the garden fence. The sun cast long shadows, and the gentle breeze carried the scent of blooming flowers. It was a beautiful day, yet I felt a heavy sadness. Suddenly Jake looked up and caught my gaze. For a moment the distance between us seemed to disappear. He gave me a small, sad smile before returning to his work. That night I lay awake again, wrestling with my thoughts. I realized I had to make a decision, to either let go of what Jake represented or to face the complicated emotions head-on. Neither choice was easy. The next day I decided to talk to Jake. I invited him inside after he finished fixing a broken window latch. We sat in the kitchen, the afternoon light filtering through the curtains. "Jake," I began hesitantly, "I need to be honest with you. Things have changed and I'm not sure where we stand anymore." He nodded, his eyes reflecting the seriousness of the moment. "I felt that too. I don't want to lose the friendship we've built," I continued. "But I also don't want to ignore the tension between us." Jake sighed deeply. "Neither do I. I care about you and I want to support you. But I also respect your situation." We talked for a long time that afternoon about boundaries, respect, and the need for honesty. It was one of the most meaningful conversations I had had in a long time. From that day on, we both agreed to keep things professional. Jake would continue helping around the house and I would focus on rebuilding the parts of my life that had been neglected. It wasn't easy to step back from the closeness we had shared, but it was necessary. I realized that sometimes the most caring thing you can do is to set boundaries, even when your heart wants something different. As the weeks went by, I noticed small changes in myself. I started reconnecting with old friends and focusing more on my own well-being. The loneliness that had once felt overwhelming began to fade, replaced by a quiet strength. Jake remained a steady presence, always professional and kind. Our conversations were lighter, filled with simple topics and occasional laughter. One evening, as he packed up his tools after fixing a fence gate, he turned to me and said, "You're doing really well. I'm proud of you." His words warmed my heart and I smiled genuinely for the first time in months. Life was far from perfect, but I was learning to accept its imperfections and find peace within them. Looking back, I realized that the day my son crossed a boundary that changed everything was not just a turning point in my family life. It was also a moment of growth and self-discovery for me. Sometimes, the hardest challenges lead us to the strongest versions of ourselves. And though the path ahead was uncertain, I was ready to face it with courage and hope. Time was passing, but the unrest in my heart had not yet settled. Every day I faced new challenges in my life that sometimes left me feeling confused and overwhelmed. That day, the day my son crossed that boundary, was still fresh in my mind. I kept thinking everything was over, but life had other plans. It brought both beautiful moments and difficult times that made me stronger. My husband had grown quieter at home. I could see the anger and pain in his eyes, even though he never spoke about it. Between us, there was a silent wall, one that blurred our conversations and created distance. I understood he was hurting just like me, but the space between us kept growing. During these difficult times, I realized I had to take care of myself. I started talking more with my friends, trying to understand my feelings. Sometimes I would write in my diary, letting my emotions flow onto the pages so my heart felt lighter. One day I went to see my mother. She listened carefully without judging or interrupting. I saw love and understanding in her eyes. She told me, "Life sometimes brings moments that scare us, but your courage will lead you forward." Her words gave me some peace. I promised myself that I wouldn't give up and that someday life would smile again. One evening as I was coming home, I saw my son standing alone by the window. Sadness was in his eyes, but there was also a hidden understanding. I walked up to him and gently asked, "Son, do you want to talk to me?" He hesitated for a moment, then said, "Mom, I'm sorry. I know I hurt you." Tears welled up in my eyes. I held his hand and told him, "Making mistakes is part of being human. What matters most is that we learn from them. From that day on, we began to talk openly. He started understanding his mistakes and worked on improving himself. I too began to share my feelings more honestly. Another thing that helped me a lot was taking time for myself. Every day I spent some moments doing things I loved. Reading books, enjoying tea in the evening, or just sitting quietly. These small joys gave me the strength to live again. My son also began showing more responsibility and maturity. Sometimes he would ask me, "Mom, am I doing better now?" I always encouraged him, "Yes, son, you're doing great. Keep working hard." Those moments became very precious to me. I felt our relationship was healing and growing stronger. One day when my husband came home, I saw a change in his eyes too. He smiled and said, "Forgive me for being so distant." I took his hand and replied, "I'm sorry too. Let's work together to make our life better." That day marked a new beginning for us. We started sharing our feelings honestly, opening up about our pains and joys. I realized that every relationship fights its own battles. But if we approach them with understanding and love, even the toughest roads become easier to walk. Now there was peace in our family. Every day we tried to understand each other better and build a stronger bond. I believed that we could be happy together again. Every new day brought hope. This part of my life taught me that even after pain and sorrow, hope and love can prevail. To anyone going through hard times, I want to say, never lose courage. Life can get better again, just open your heart and keep moving forward. Even though life had been tough, I slowly began to see small rays of hope shining through the darkness. Healing doesn't happen overnight, but with time, patience, and effort, things started changing in ways I never thought possible. After the difficult events with my son and the tension that followed, we began to rebuild the trust that had broken between us. It wasn't easy. Some days were harder than others. But step by step, we found ways to communicate better, to listen more carefully, and to support each other even when things felt uncertain. One afternoon, I was sitting in the living room when my son came to me quietly. His face was serious but calm, and I could tell he had something important to say. He looked at me and said, "Mom, I want to thank you for not giving up on me even when I made mistakes. I realize now how much I hurt you and I want to be better." His words touched me deeply. I smiled and took his hand, telling him, "I love you no matter what, and everyone deserves a chance to grow." From that moment, it felt like a new chapter had started for both of us. We began spending more time together, talking, sharing small moments, and slowly healing the wounds from the past. My husband, too, seemed to be healing in his own way. Though he wasn't the kind to express his feelings easily, I noticed him making efforts to be more present. He would ask about my day, join us for dinner more often, and sometimes even laugh again like before. The house that once felt heavy with silence started to feel warm and welcoming. I realized that forgiveness and understanding were the keys to restoring our family's happiness. At the same time, I made a promise to myself that I would never lose sight of my own well-being. I started to prioritize self-care. Simple things like taking walks in the fresh air, reading books that inspired me, and reconnecting with old friends who lifted my spirit. These small actions helped me regain my confidence and strength. I learned that taking care of myself was not selfish. It was necessary for me to be the best version of a mother, wife, and person. One day, I invited my son to join me for a cup of tea on the porch. The sun was setting, painting the sky with soft oranges and pinks. We sat quietly, letting the peaceful moment speak for itself. After a while, he said, "Mom, I'm sorry for crossing the line. I didn't understand before how much it affected you." I looked at him with love and replied, "I know you didn't mean to hurt me. What matters is that you learned and are trying to do better." Our conversation opened the door to more honesty and openness between us. We shared our feelings without fear of judgment. It was a relief to finally speak from the heart and be heard. With time, my son began taking more responsibility for his actions. He started setting goals for himself and working hard to achieve them. Watching him grow into a more mature and thoughtful person filled me with pride. Meanwhile, my husband and I began to rebuild the trust that had been damaged. We made a habit of sitting down regularly to talk, not just about problems but also about hopes and dreams for the future. These talks reminded me why we had fallen in love in the first place. Beneath the pain, there was still a strong bond that could be strengthened with patience and care. One evening, as we were watching a movie together, my husband reached over and held my hand. It was a simple gesture but felt like a promise to stand by each other no matter what. That moment gave me hope that our family could heal fully, even after the hardest trials. Looking back, I realized that life is never perfect. We all make mistakes, face challenges, and sometimes cross lines we shouldn't. But what truly matters is how we respond, whether we let those mistakes define us or choose to learn, forgive, and grow. My story is not just about pain or betrayal. It is about resilience, hope, and the power of love to heal even the deepest wounds. If you find yourself in a difficult place, feeling lost or broken, remember that you are not alone. Healing takes time, but it is possible. Keep your heart open, reach out for support, and believe that better days are ahead. No matter what happens, never stop fighting for yourself and those you love. Because in the end, love is what gives us strength to carry on.